It was supposed to be just another quiet morning in Tallahassee. Sunlight breaking through the trees. The sound of sprinklers, distant and steady. And then, a gunshot. Neighbors ran outside, confused. A black Lexus sat in the driveway, its doors slightly open. Inside, a man slumped over the steering wheel, motionless. That man was Dan Markel. A Harvard-educated law professor, a devoted father of two, and a man who had dedicated his life to understanding justice. Now, justice was coming for him, in the cruelest way possible. The first officers on the scene thought it might be a robbery gone wrong. Maybe someone had followed him home. But when detectives arrived, something didn't fit. His wallet was still in his pocket. His watch untouched. The shooter didn't take anything, except Dan's life. That's when it stopped being random, and started becoming personal. Investigators began piecing together his last movements. He just dropped his kids off, returned home, and parked in his driveway. Within seconds, someone walked up to his car and pulled the trigger. Police checked nearby surveillance cameras. Hours of footage, dozens of angles. And there, blurry but clear enough, was a silver Toyota Prius, slowly circling the neighborhood. The same car, again and again, at the exact time Dan was shot. That car became the thread that would unravel one of Florida's most twisted murder-for-hire plots. Dan's personal life, at least on paper, looked like success. But behind closed doors, his world was falling apart. He and his ex-wife, Wendy Adelson, were locked in a bitter custody battle over their two sons. Wendy wanted to move back to South Florida, closer to her wealthy parents, Donna and Harvey Adelson. Dan refused. The court agreed with him. That decision, one legal ruling, was about to set off a chain reaction that would destroy multiple lives. Detectives interviewed Wendy first. Her voice was calm, polite, even sad. She said she didn't know who would ever want to hurt Dan. But one line stood out. She mentioned, almost casually, that her brother Charlie had once joked about hiring a hitman to solve her problems. The detectives wrote it down. Sometimes, the truth hides inside a joke. Weeks passed. The months. The case started to cool, until a major break came from Miami. Two men, Sigfredo Garcia and Luis Rivera, were arrested in connection to unrelated crimes. When police checked Rivera's phone, they found cell tower data that placed him in Tallahassee the day Dan Markel was murdered. And the car? A rented Prius, linked to Garcia's girlfriend, a woman named Catherine Magbanua. Magbanua had ties to Charlie Adelson, Wendy's brother. And suddenly, the lines between hitmen and high society began to blur. Phone records showed a pattern, calls between Charlie, Magbanua, and the men accused of pulling the trigger. Payments disguised as loans. Conversations filled with coded language. But the name that kept surfacing, quietly, carefully, indirectly, was Donna Adelson. The matriarch. The one who had always held the family together. Detectives noticed that every key player in the murder seemed to orbit her. She called Charlie the morning after the shooting, several times. She transferred money to him. She sent text messages that sounded innocent but carried weight when placed in context. She wrote to Wendy, "You did nothing wrong. We just need to be careful." By the time investigators mapped the timeline, one thing became clear: this wasn't a spur-of-the-moment act. It was a calculated plan. Months in the making. A family desperate to bring their daughter and grandchildren back home. A son willing to find someone who could fix the problem. And a mother who, prosecutors would later argue, helped orchestrate the entire thing from behind the scenes. Dan Markel's death wasn't random. It was a deal. A deal that came with a price tag, and a trail of phone calls that would haunt the Adelson family for years. But for now, the case was far from over. The killers were in custody, the middlewoman was under pressure, and Charlie Adelson was getting nervous. The FBI was closing in. And somewhere in South Florida, Donna Adelson was doing everything she could to keep the family's secrets buried. Because when you build a life on lies, it's only a matter of time before the truth catches up. Before we continue, if stories like this fascinate you, if you believe real justice begins when the truth is finally exposed, take a second to like this video and subscribe. It helps bring light to cases that deserve to be remembered. The walls of the Adelson family's world didn't crumble all at once. They cracked slowly, one secret at a time. By late 2016, 2 years after Dan Markel's murder, the case had gone from cold to complicated. Detectives had the hitmen, but the real question, the one that everyone whispered, was simple. Who paid for it? Sigfredo Garcia, one of the gunmen, eventually started to talk. His story was rough, broken, defensive. He claimed he'd been paid through his ex-girlfriend, Catherine Magbanua. She, in turn, pointed toward her wealthy boyfriend, Charlie Adelson. Charlie had money, connections, and a sharp smile that could mask almost anything. But there was something about him, something that made investigators sure he knew more than he ever said. The problem? They had no direct proof. Just phone logs, texts, circumstantial evidence. Until they decided to plant a wire. In 2016, the FBI set up one of the most quietly brilliant sting operations in Florida's history. They approached Magbanua's associate, someone who had connections to the Adelsons, and asked them to deliver a simple message to Charlie. It was fake, of course. A setup. The note said, "I know what happened to the professor. Let's talk." When that message reached Charlie, panic rippled through the family. Calls started flying between him, Donna, and Wendy. Not angry calls, frightened ones. Short, controlled, full of tension. Charlie immediately called his mother. And in that conversation, investigators heard something that changed everything. Donna told him, "We need to figure this out fast." She wasn't confused. She wasn't shocked. She was managing it, like someone used to solving problems quietly. A few days later, Charlie and Catherine met for lunch at Dolce Vita, a busy Italian restaurant. What they didn't know was that every word, every whisper, was being recorded by hidden microphones. The tapes were tense, almost cinematic. You could hear plates clinking, laughter that didn't sound real, and under it all, fear. Charlie joked nervously about the TV people being onto him, about how they could be wearing wires. At one point, he said, if they had any real evidence, we'd already be arrested. It was arrogance and panic rolled into one sentence, and investigators knew it. The recordings didn't just capture Charlie's paranoia. They hinted at a family system where silence was power. When Donna called later, her tone was calm, rehearsed, like a mother who'd spent years teaching her children to keep their stories straight. She told Charlie, "We're being watched. We have to be careful what we say." That phrase would later echo in courtrooms and documentaries, because careful people usually have something to hide. Over the next few years, the net tightened. Garcia was convicted. Magbanua was charged. And every time another person flipped or spoke, the evidence crept closer to the Adelsons. Then came the final thread, a forensic one. Bank records revealed a series of payments from the Adelson dental practice to Magbanua, disguised as salary. The total? Exactly the amount prosecutors believed had been used to pay the hitmen. The luxury, the family vacations, the calm suburban facade, all of it began to look like camouflage. But Donna, even then, refused to break. She played the role of the grandmother, the victim of a media circus, the woman who had lost so much. She smiled in photos, stayed close to her daughter, and avoided every public comment about the case. Behind closed doors, though, she was watching the walls close in. Her son Charlie was about to stand trial. Her family's name, the one she'd protected for decades, was about to become national news. Then, in 2022, during Charlie Adelson's trial, something extraordinary happened. Prosecutors played the Dolce Vita tapes. The room fell silent. Hearing his own voice, those jokes about the murder, the fear of being caught, destroyed any illusion of innocence. And as the jury listened, Donna's world began to collapse in real time. When the guilty verdict came in, cameras caught her face. No tears. No outburst. Just a long, distant stare, like she'd already known this moment would come. But the story wasn't over. Because Donna wasn't done running. Months later, as prosecutors prepared to indict her, she and her husband booked one-way tickets out of the country. They were stopped at the airport, luggage packed, passports ready, no plans to return. And that's when it ended. After nearly a decade of secrets, The matriarch of the Adelson family, the woman who once held everything together, was finally in handcuffs. To the world, she was a grandmother. To prosecutors, she was the quiet architect of a murder. When asked why she thought she could get away with it, one investigator simply said, "Because she thought she was smarter than the system." But justice is patient. In the next part, the courtroom lights expose everything. The verdicts, the reactions, the fall of a family who believed their wealth could outsmart truth. Before we move on, if you've stayed with this story so far, hit like, share, and subscribe. It's one small way to help keep real cases like this alive in public memory. Because when silence wins, justice loses. When the courtroom doors opened that morning, it wasn't just another trial. It was the end of a family dynasty, and the moment truth finally demanded payment. Donna Adelson sat perfectly still. Her hands folded in her lap, her pearl earrings glinting under the fluorescent lights. She looked calm. But every camera in that room knew, calm doesn't mean innocent. Prosecutors called her the silent architect. The mother who didn't pull the trigger, but helped build the world that made it possible. Her son, Charlie Adelson, had already been convicted, life in prison for orchestrating the murder of Dan Markel. His phone calls, his jokes, his arrogance, all caught on tape, all undeniable. Now it was Donna's turn. The mother who had taught him to be careful. The woman whose emails and phone calls showed an awareness she never meant the world to see. As the evidence was presented, it painted a portrait of control. Quiet, precise, deliberate control. Donna wasn't impulsive. She didn't shout. She didn't threaten. She simply planned. Prosecutors revealed message after message. Phone records that tied her to Charlie in the hours after the murder, money transfers disguised as loans, words that sounded like concern but read like coded relief. And then came the recordings, Donna's own voice from years later, talking to her son about what would happen if the hitmen talked. She said, "We need to get ahead of it." Those 5 words hung heavy in the room. They weren't the words of a mother grieving justice. They were the words of someone managing damage. Donna's defense team tried to reframe her. They called her a loving mother, a loyal parent, a victim of overreach. They painted her as someone trapped in her family's mistakes. But the jury didn't see confusion. They saw control. For the first time in public, Donna looked small, her posture stiff, her hands shaking ever so slightly when the photos of Dan Markel's car were shown. The silence in the courtroom was suffocating. Dan's parents sat in the front row, their faces carved by years of waiting. They'd spent nearly a decade pushing for this moment, not out of vengeance, but out of something quieter, the need for truth. The need to finally look into the eyes of the woman who had stolen their son's future. When the verdict was read, there was no gasp, no chaos. Just a low hum of whispers and the sound of the gavel. Guilty. Donna Adelson closed her eyes. Just for a second. Then she opened them again, and the mask was gone. Reporters would later describe it as the moment the facade cracked, when the woman who had once been the power behind the family name finally realized that no amount of money, no flight plan, no silence could undo what had been done. Outside the courthouse, rain started to fall. Fitting, people said, because the story had always felt like a storm, slow to form, impossible to stop, devastating once it hit. Donna was sentenced to life in prison without parole. Her family fractured. Her husband retreated from the public eye. Her daughter, Wendy, kept her distance, quiet, cautious, unresponsive to the media. In prison, Donna Adelson became what she'd once feared most, forgotten. The cameras moved on. The headlines faded. But the story lingered, not because of the crime itself, but because of what it said about family, control, and the illusion of power. Dan Markel's friends and colleagues never stopped speaking his name. They described him as brilliant, passionate, kind. A man who believed in the law even when the law failed him. And maybe that's the cruelest irony of all. He taught justice for a living. And in the end, justice came, but at a cost no one could have imagined. The Adelson case wasn't just about one family's downfall. It was a mirror. A reflection of how far people will go to protect comfort, image, and control, even when it means destroying everything they claim to love. Donna once said, family is everything. And she was right. It was everything. Until it wasn't. If you've followed this story until now, thank you for being part of the truth that finally caught up to it. If you believe stories like this matter, stories about justice, betrayal, and the thin line between love and destruction, please take a second to like, subscribe, and share. It helps more people discover these stories. It keeps the memory of the victims alive. Because silence protects no one. And justice, no matter how long it takes, always finds its way home.